whispers traveled faster than armies. In the mountains of Persia, a brotherhood emerged whose dagger reshaped empires without commanding one. The Hashashins served no king, only conviction. Hidden in eagle nests of stone, they trained in silence, striking with precision that terrified sultans, caliphs, and crusader lords alike. Their power lay not in numbers, but in certainty. Any enemy could fall, anywhere, at any moment. Yet behind the legends of assassins and impossible devotion stood a deeper story, how belief, discipline, and fear forged a force that proved the mind can wound more profoundly than any blade. Acre stood at the edge of a fragile world, a coastal stronghold where merchants bargained, pilgrims prayed, and ambitious men hoped to carve their names into the shifting fate of the Crusader kingdoms. Among them walked Conrad of Montferrat, a seasoned noble whose resolve had earned him the loyalty of soldiers and the respect of kings. His rise had been swift. After defending Tyre from siege, he was chosen as king-elect of Jerusalem, a title burdened with promises and enemies. Many saw him as the figure who might stabilize the fractured Latin states. Others saw him as an obstacle. Have you ever wondered how a single moment in a crowded street can change the fate of empires? On that warm afternoon, Conrad moved through Acre's streets with the calm assurance of a man accustomed to danger, yet unaware that the greatest threat rarely shows itself as a marching army. Two familiar figures approached him, men he believed to be monks or humble servants who had offered support during his political ascent. Nothing in their posture suggested violence. No raised voices, no sudden rush, no glint of hostility. Conrad offered a greeting, thinking only of the responsibilities awaiting him beyond the city walls. The first blade entered beneath his ribs before he could draw breath. The second followed with brutal precision. His guards surged forward, cutting down one assailant and chasing the other through a maze of stone alleys. When cornered, the surviving killer revealed a truth that echoed far beyond Acre. He was no monk, but a member of a hidden fraternity, one that struck rulers wherever it chose. A group whose reach extended from the peaks of Persia to the courts of Syria. A movement shaped by doctrines, rivalries, and centuries of conflicts unknown to Conrad's world. His murder was not an isolated act. It was the distant thunder of a storm born long before Crusader armies set foot in the Holy Land. To understand how a king-elect could fall to two men disguised as allies, one must return to the world that forged such assassins, a world where theology, power, and survival intertwined in ways as intricate as any sword stroke. Across Persia, generations before Conrad's rise, tensions simmered within the vast expanse of the Islamic world. The decline of the Abbasid Caliphate loosened the threads that once held a vast empire together. Baghdad's palatial courts, once the heart of an immense dominion, struggled to maintain influence over distant provinces. Local dynasties strengthened their grip, shaping their own networks of loyalty. While some regions prospered through trade and scholarship, others drifted into uncertainty as rival families, governors, and generals asserted competing visions of authority. Amid this political fragmentation, debates about rightful spiritual leadership intensified. These discussions were not abstract philosophical arguments. They were the foundation of identity for entire communities. Shia scholars emphasized a lineage of divinely guided leaders descending from the Prophet's family. 12 thinkers awaited the return of a hidden imam. Others traced spiritual authority through Ismail, whose descendants shaped a distinct branch of doctrine, ritual, and allegiance. Persia offered fertile ground for these ideas to flourish. Cities like Ray and Isfahan became crossroads where scholars, travelers, and preachers exchanged interpretations and contested truths. In these circles, a young man named Hassan, later known as Hassani Saba, received his education. Born into a Twelver household, he encountered the intellectual diversity of his time early. Arguments flowed from one lesson to the next. Questions of divine authority, succession, and the nature of leadership. Hassan's transformation began not through dramatic visions or miracles, but through earnest debate. A visiting Ismaili preacher challenged his assumptions, unveiling layers of meaning within scripture that Hassan had not previously considered. Doubt intertwined with fascination. Over time, the preacher's words took root, and what began as skepticism evolved into conviction. Conversion in this era was never a quiet matter. It shaped loyalties, altered futures, and placed individuals in conflict with the governing powers. These powers, by the late 11th century, were embodied by the Seljuk Turks. Their empire spanned from Central Asia to the Mediterranean, upheld by disciplined soldiers and guided by Sunni orthodoxy. To the Seljuks, Ismaili teachings represented not just theological error, but political danger. Any community claiming allegiance to an imam outside the recognized authority threatened the coherence of Seljuk governance. Officials monitored correspondence, interrogated suspected dissidents, and punished deviations as acts of rebellion. Into this climate, Hassan stepped with increasing resolve. His commitment to Ismaili doctrine grew alongside his understanding of how vulnerable its followers were. He traveled between cities, building relationships, converting sympathizers, and analyzing the weaknesses of Seljuk administration. In this period, he learned more than theology. He learned strategy, persuasion, and patience. Far from Persia, Cairo shone as the seat of the Fatimid Caliphate, an Ismaili state whose libraries attracted scholars from across continents. Fatimid missionaries spread doctrine through Yemen, Syria, and India, constructing a web of loyalty that linked distant communities under a shared spiritual leadership. Their presence offered both hope and danger. Hope because many in Persia felt oppressed and marginalized. Danger because the Seljuks considered these networks subversive. Missionaries reached northern Persia, where rugged mountains rose above isolated villages. In regions like Dalam, locals guarded independence fiercely. Their strongholds dotted the landscape, natural fortifications shaped by centuries of defending against larger powers. When Ismaili preachers arrived, they found audiences willing to question Seljuk authority, especially in areas suffering from heavy taxation or local rivalries. Hassan recognized the strategic potential of these mountains immediately. Their ridges shielded communities from imperial armies. Their valleys offered concealment and mobility. Their fortresses, if held by loyal followers, could become the backbone of a new kind of state, one built not on sweeping plains, but on heights unreachable to most foes. Meanwhile, dissatisfaction grew across the Seljuk realm. Governors clashed with local elites, soldiers demanded pay, and merchants navigated unpredictable taxes. The empire's powerful viziers attempted to maintain order, yet every hard decision created new enemies. For many common people, the choice between loyalty and rebellion became less clear each year. Fear of instability pulled families into factions. A single rumor of a tax increase, a harsh new ruler, or an approaching army could unsettle entire districts. Under such conditions, covert movements gained momentum. Some joined the Ismaili cause quietly, drawn by promises of justice and unity. Others did so out of defiance. Through these journeys and observations, Hassan's purpose sharpened. The world was fractured. The Seljuk state, though formidable, carried cracks that widened with every conflict. Ideas could spread through these cracks, but ideas alone could not secure a future. What he sought now was a stronghold, both a sanctuary and a base from which a disciplined community could rise. In the mountains south of the Caspian Sea stood a fortress called Alamut. Remote, formidable, and held by a garrison increasingly sympathetic to dissident ideas, it represented more than a military asset. It was a possibility, a place where belief could transform into action, where a persecuted sect could reshape its destiny. Long before Conrad fell beneath 2 blades in Acre, the roots of that act extended into these mountains, into Hassan's decisions, and into the world that had pushed him toward them. The story of the assassins did not begin with a killing. It began with fractures in faith, shifting empires, and the unyielding will of a man seeking refuge in a world where none seemed available. Beyond Persia's mountain corridors and the Seljuk palaces, where officials debated matters of empire, news of unrest traveled slowly. Caravans carried stories from village to village, shaping perceptions of events unfolding far beyond the horizon. In towns perched along trade routes, travelers spoke of scholars in Cairo arguing about doctrine, of Seljuk generals securing distant frontiers, and of missionaries who arrived quietly and left behind new loyalties. These tales blended fact and rumor, yet each message revealed how deeply the Islamic world had entered a period of questioning. Ideas no longer flowed in a single direction. They branched like streams after heavy rain. Across the Caspian littoral, communities often found themselves at the margins of imperial authority, caught between local traditions and the demands of faraway capitals. Village elders balanced the expectations of tax collectors with the concerns of families who feared losing what little they possessed. Into these regions stepped men shaped by conviction, moving from settlement to settlement, sharing teachings in private homes or secluded gardens. Their arrival did not always cause immediate transformation. It planted possibilities. A debate sparked over supper, a whispered conversation during a walk, a question posed at the edge of a field. These small exchanges gradually fostered networks of trust. Hassan moved through these landscapes with deliberate purpose. He learned to read the mood of a village before speaking, sensed when to present doctrine openly and when to offer only hints. Years of navigating Seljuk watchfulness had taught him restraint. In some towns, sympathizers already laid the groundwork, softening resistance through patient outreach. In others, fear of reprisal forced discussions into late-night gatherings behind shuttered doors. This steady, careful expansion laid the foundation for something larger, though few could yet imagine what form it would take. Escalating tensions within the Fatimid realm influenced this delicate work. When internal disputes fractured their leadership, adherents across the east had to choose where to place their allegiance. Some leaned toward established hierarchies in Cairo. Others followed lines of succession they believed more legitimate. This decision affected not only prayers and rituals, but also alliances, loyalties, and security. Hassan aligned himself with those who supported the legitimacy of Nizar's lineage. This stance isolated him from factions that submitted to rival claimants, yet it also granted him moral certainty at a time when clarity was rare. Meanwhile, Seljuk administrators grew increasingly wary of doctrines they considered destabilizing. Lists of suspected dissidents circulated among governors, and informants traveled roads as frequently as merchants. Arrests occurred in periodic waves, each one deepening resentment in communities already uneasy under foreign rule. Families torn apart by accusations remembered these injuries. As children grew into adulthood, many adopted the beliefs their parents had once concealed. A cycle emerged. Repression strengthened commitment rather than extinguishing it. This situation demanded adaptation. Hassan and his companions refined their methods, turning to coded messages, discrete signals, and strategic dispersal. Pious phrases, hidden within letters, carried double meanings. Travelers, disguised as artisans or traders, exchanged information during brief stops at caravanserais. Efforts at secrecy did not imply weakness. They reflected a recognition that survival required discipline equal to conviction. Northward, the ridges of the Elburz range cast long shadows over valleys, dotted with fortresses. Some of these strongholds belonged to local families, others to semi-independent warlords whose authority fluctuated with each season. A few had changed hands multiple times over the centuries, their walls bearing scars from sieges long forgotten. In these mountains, the notion of resisting larger powers was not extraordinary. Generations had done so through force of will and intimate knowledge of terrain. When missionary networks reached these areas, they encountered communities predisposed to autonomy. Among the fortresses that drew Hassan's attention, Alamut possessed attributes that set it apart from the rest. Situated on a high rock with steep sides, it commanded approaches from several directions. Its narrow pathways and formidable position made it nearly impervious to conventional assault. Yet the fortress was more than stone and elevation. Its inhabitants, increasingly exposed to Ismaili teachings, formed a population that leaned toward dissent. This combination of geography and sentiment positioned Alamut as a potential nucleus for something unprecedented, a secure seat from which ideas might radiate outward rather than inward. While this possibility grew clearer to Hassan, the Seljuk court faced complications of its own. Rival viziers, ambitious princes, and shifting loyalties among military commanders strained internal cohesion. Each passing year exposed vulnerabilities that might once have remained hidden behind ceremonial grandeur. Battles on distant frontiers drained resources. Courtiers sought alliances with influential chiefs or governors. Local disputes escalated into confrontations requiring imperial attention. Every moment of distraction created openings for groups operating outside the imperial framework. Such circumstances did not guarantee success for any dissident movement, but they created space to maneuver. Hassan understood that the empire's outward strength concealed internal uncertainty. He also recognized that his mission needed more than scattered communities and clandestine meetings. A movement could not endure solely through persuasion. It required an anchor. Without a center, without a place where teaching, strategy, and leadership converged, efforts would remain vulnerable to the empire's reach. During this period, stories circulated about his travels. Nights spent in remote villages, months living under false names, weeks studying local dynamics before revealing his identity. These experiences sharpened his understanding of both opportunity and danger. He knew that loyalty gained through enthusiasm alone could falter under pressure. True commitment required structure, guidance, and shared purpose. The emerging network needed a sanctuary where its followers could gather, learn, and prepare. Mountains alone could not provide this cohesion. A fortress could. Not any fortress, but one embedded in a region naturally suited for resistance. Alamut represented the ideal candidate. Its location granted safety. Its population held potential. Its symbolic value, once properly shaped, could unify scattered adherents under a single banner. Yet approaching it directly as an outsider risked failure. Gaining influence required patience, subtlety, and an understanding of internal dynamics. Hassan observed the fortress from afar, studying its rhythms, its guards, its allies, and the outlook of local leaders. Gradually, contacts exchanged information about those sympathetic to his message and those skeptical of the empire's demands. The moment for decisive action had not yet arrived, but the path was visible. He moved closer, traveling through routes known only to mountain folk, visiting surrounding villages and forging connections essential for what would come next. Beyond these local developments, the larger Islamic world continued to fracture. Debates about succession and divine authority influenced politics far beyond religious scholarship. Preachers drew parallels between past injustices and present conditions. Urban unrest sparked by taxation or corruption often carried undertones of sectarian tension. This convergence of grievances produced an atmosphere where ideas could move quickly through the population. A message that spoke to both spiritual yearning and political frustration gained momentum. As the century drew toward its final decades, the Seljuk court's authority shifted yet again. Leadership changed hands due to illness, intrigue, or sudden death. Each transition left portions of the empire uncertain about policy or allegiance. For those who opposed Seljuk control, these fluctuations served as reminders that imperial stability could not be taken for granted. Movements guided by determination and purpose could exploit this uncertainty if they acted with precision. Hassan understood the significance of timing. If his plans advanced too quickly, they risked attracting overwhelming force. If they moved too slowly, communities might lose faith or fall under harsher control. His strategies required a balance between expansion and concealment. Reports of his activities sometimes reached Seljuk officials, prompting searches or interrogations. Yet each time, he managed to evade capture. Allies hid him in secluded dwellings or guided him along mountain paths, invisible from the main roads. In these years, his role shifted from itinerant preacher to organizer, capable of envisioning a structure that transcended individual villages. The concept of a mountain refuge evolved into a vision of a fortified community bound by doctrine, discipline, and shared purpose. Alamut, still beyond his reach, represented the culmination of this vision, a place where a new model of resistance could emerge, one that relied not on large armies, but on commitment, intelligence, and coordinated action. Communities that sympathized with the Ismaili cause began to look anxiously toward the mountains, wondering if rumors about a new center of leadership held truth. Some feared reprisals if they offered support. Others saw the possibility of a more equitable society, free from heavy-handed governors or punitive laws. As these expectations grew, the need for decisive leadership intensified. Hassan recognized that the moment of preparation had reached its limit. Networks now stretched across regions. Sympathizers awaited direction. Conditions within the Seljuk state hinted at further instability. The mountains murmured with anticipation. What remained was the transition from idea to embodiment, from movement to state. In these final years, before Alamut entered his life fully, Hassan gathered the resolve necessary for a step that would alter the course of Persian and Syrian history. By securing a fortress, he aimed to create not just a refuge, but a center capable of shaping events and influencing rulers across continents. Once established, such a citadel could train disciplined followers, preserve teachings, and conduct operations beyond the reach of traditional power. Long before Conrad fell to daggers in Acre, the foundations of that act were built here, in hesitant conversations, in hidden gatherings, in mountain shadows, and in the quiet conviction of a man who recognized that the world had entered an age where empires weakened, Doctrines competed, and ideas sharpened into weapons. Morning in the mountain valleys often began with silence, a silence so complete that even the wind seemed to hesitate before crossing the ridgelines. Far below Alamut's cragged perch, shepherds led their flocks through narrow paths, unaware that the fortress above their heads would soon become the center of a transformation, unlike anything the region had seen. In these early years, Alamut appeared as just another Dailami stronghold, isolated, practical, weathered by centuries of conflict. No one yet imagined that it would become the heart of a movement capable of terrifying kings. But across the scattered villages and high passes, small changes signaled that a new force had begun to take shape. For nearly a decade, Hassan traveled through northern Persia with a single purpose. He cultivated alliances, strengthened covert networks, and identified communities willing to resist Seljuk authority. His travels required discretion and unyielding discipline. Each stop, whether in a valley hamlet or a fortified outpost, demanded a new approach. Sometimes he spoke openly. Other times he listened, waiting for moments when trust revealed itself. His reputation grew among those who sought alternatives to imperial domination. Yet he remained cautious, a rumor in the wrong place, an indiscreet follower, a careless word. Any misstep could undo years of patient preparation. The Ismaili missionary hierarchy, known as the Dawa, provided a structure that guided Hassan's efforts. Experienced preachers coordinated activity across regions, ensuring that each new convert received instruction and support. Through this system, he built a foundation sturdy enough to support ambitious plans. Still, the Dawa alone could not guarantee survival. Persecution intensified whenever Seljuk authorities uncovered even whispers of dissent. Hassan's networks had to be more than ideological. They had to be resilient. In these circumstances, his attention shifted toward the northern mountains. The region's geography shaped its people, independent, wary of outsiders, and accustomed to guarding what little autonomy they possessed. Here, dynasties rose and fell with local loyalties. Fortress lords acted as semi-independent rulers, negotiating with or resisting larger powers depending on circumstance. This fractured landscape offered advantages. Small communities, loyal to one another, could hide sympathizers from imperial eyes. Narrow passes forced armies to move cautiously. And the numerous strongholds, some abandoned, others lightly garrisoned, lay ready for someone bold enough to claim them. Among these fortresses, Alamut emerged as the most promising. Perched on a long, rocky spur, it dominated surrounding valleys and controlled routes through the region. Its outer slopes were steep, its inner chambers secure, and its water supply reliable. Any commander holding Alamut could survive sieges and project authority over nearby settlements. Hassan recognized these qualities immediately. Geography could be destiny. The right stronghold could transform a persecuted movement into a formidable presence. Before approaching Alamut, however, Hassan needed to shape the region's political environment. He dispatched trusted missionaries into neighboring villages. Their task was simple but essential: build relationships, offer guidance, and cultivate loyalty. Over time, the garrison assigned to Alamut began hearing new ideas from relatives, friends, and acquaintances. Not all converts joined out of devotion. Some sought refuge from Seljuk pressure. Others looked for leadership beyond corrupt local officials. Whatever their reasons, each new supporter expanded Hassan's influence. Throughout these years, Seljuk officials remained unaware of the quiet shifts occurring in the mountains. They focused on larger threats: rival princes, rebellious governors, and distant campaigns. A remote fortress near Dalam did not demand immediate attention. That allowed Hassan to move carefully. Eventually, he traveled toward Alamut himself, avoiding populated routes and hiding his identity beneath layers of caution. Upon arrival, he adopted the name Dihuda, blending into local life as a scholar and tutor. His presence raised little concern. The fortress housed families, children, and administrators accustomed to seeing instructors and scribes. Inside Alamut, Hassan observed everything. He studied the routines of guards, the attitudes of officers, the relationships tying the community together. Slowly, he identified sympathizers, men influenced by earlier missionaries, women who had embraced Ismaili teachings, youths eager to question Seljuk authority. He spoke humbly, never revealing his true identity too soon. Instead, he encouraged discussion, offering clarity where confusion lingered and guidance where uncertainty prevailed. Each conversation deepened the foundation he needed. The fortress governor, Mahdi, remained unaware of Hassan's role at first. Confident in his position, he saw no reason to monitor every teacher within his walls. Yet signs of shifting loyalty eventually reached him. Word spread through the garrison that Hassan's teachings resonated, that people looked to him for moral direction. Such changes did not immediately alarm the governor, but they unsettled him. Allegiance within a fortress must be stable. Any hint of internal division could weaken defenses. By the time Mahdi acted, it was too late. The structure of loyalty had already changed. Prominent garrison members supported Hassan more firmly than they supported their governor. When Mahdi attempted to confront him, he found himself isolated. The very soldiers sworn to defend the fortress no longer obeyed his commands with certainty. Their silence, their hesitations, their diverted gazes, each signaled that authority had passed quietly into new hands. The confrontation ended without violence. Mahdi realized that remaining would provoke conflict he could not win. Under growing pressure, he abandoned Alamut, leaving the fortress to Hassan and those who had chosen his cause. This event would later become the subject of legends, stories claiming that Hassan purchased the stronghold with a cleverly worded agreement, or that he seized it without shedding a single drop of blood. The truth, as always, carried less ornamentation, but far greater significance. The transfer of power resulted from loyalty, patience, and the disciplined advance of a movement that had prepared meticulously for this moment. Once Hassan assumed control, the fortress changed rapidly. The halls that once echoed with administrative routines now filled with discussions of doctrine, political strategy, and future plans. Hassan reorganized leadership structures, strengthening ties between Alamut and other Ismaili communities. He established clear hierarchies within the fortress: instructors who taught new converts, commanders who managed defenses, and emissaries who carried messages across vast distances. This order transformed Alamut from a simple mountain stronghold into a nerve center with unified purpose. News of Alamut's shift spread slowly at first, then with accelerating speed. In nearby valleys, villagers who had long endured Seljuk taxation found reassurance in the idea of a fortified refuge aligned with their grievances. Supporters in distant cities heard of Hassan's achievement through coded letters or whispered reports. Even skeptics, previously hesitant to align themselves with dissidents, reconsidered their stance. A fortress held by loyal followers represented stability, protection, and the possibility of continued resistance. The Seljuk court responded with alarm once details reached the capital. Officials realized that a dissident leader had secured a nearly impregnable base in a strategically sensitive region. Armies were dispatched to retake Alamut, but the fortress defied conventional siege tactics. Narrow approaches limited the number of attackers. Defensive structures allowed Hassan's followers to repel assaults with minimal resources. Moreover, the surrounding terrain made it difficult for imperial troops to supply themselves during prolonged campaigns. Seljuk efforts, though determined, achieved little. Each failed attempt strengthened the Ismaili position and deepened Hassan's reputation. His followers viewed him not only as a spiritual guide, but as a tactician capable of outmaneuvering an empire. Resistance became more organized. Outlying strongholds were fortified and brought into closer cooperation with Alamut. The network of mountain fortresses, once scattered and independent, started to resemble a coordinated landscape of defense. Alamut's significance extended beyond military strategy. Within its walls, Hassan reshaped the Dawa. He emphasized loyalty to Nizar's lineage, reinforcing the doctrinal foundation of the emerging Nizari movement. Leaders gathered to refine teachings, standardize communication, and establish protocols that would guide operations for decades. This internal consolidation mattered as much as territorial control. A fortress might withstand siege, but only a disciplined community could withstand time. From this secure base, Ismaili influence expanded across the region. Some communities strengthened their allegiance. Others entered negotiations with Hassan's representatives. In a world where imperial politics changed rapidly, many local leaders saw advantage in aligning themselves with a force capable of resisting external pressures. Each alliance broadened the movement's reach and increased its resilience. Yet Hassan's ambition extended further. Alamut provided the foundation, but the vision ahead required more than defense. The Seljuks remained powerful, capable of launching campaigns that could devastate even the strongest mountain refuge. Hassan understood that opposition to such an empire demanded unconventional methods. Direct confrontation would lead to destruction. Subtle influence offered a different path. The world beyond Alamut lay full of governors, generals, and viziers who shaped policy through fear or favor. If their decisions could be altered carefully, selectively, an entire empire could be influenced without the need for a traditional army. This realization would lead to tactics that reshaped the political landscape of Persia and Syria. But before these methods took form, the movement needed roots deep enough to endure pressure and a fortress strong enough to protect its purpose. Through patience, strategy, and conviction, Hassan had secured both. Alamut no longer belonged to a remote governor or a passing dynasty. It belonged to a movement defined by discipline, bound by belief, and guided by a man whose understanding of power differed from any ruler in the region. What began as a quiet shift within a mountain community now stood as the heart of a new order, one that had learned how to survive in the shadows and, when necessary, shape history from them. Even after Hassan secured Alamut, the fortress remained more promise than power. Stones alone could not guarantee survival. What mattered was how those stones would be used, how the narrow corridors, hidden chambers, and commanding terraces would be transformed into the framework of a new order. Alamut had changed hands quietly, without battle or spectacle, but the world beyond its walls had not yet understood what this shift signaled. To neighboring communities, the transition looked like a local dispute. To the Seljuks, it seemed a minor disturbance. Only Hassan grasped the deeper meaning. He now possessed a refuge able to withstand an empire's anger. The first priority was creating cohesion. Families living inside the fortress had grown accustomed to the previous governor's leadership, and while many supported Hassan's teachings, support alone did not constitute unity. He met with elders, mediators, and respected figures among the garrison, explaining how the fortress would operate under the new administration. Negotiations shaped the early rules, discipline in training, shared responsibilities in maintenance, and a council that could implement decisions quickly. Structure replaced uncertainty, and structure reduced fear. Alamut began to resemble not merely a captured fortress, but an organized community. Beyond organizing daily life, Hassan needed to secure the surrounding valleys. Mountain districts relied on complex networks of loyalty, often based on family connections or long-standing disputes. A fortress could not stand isolated. It needed dependable allies for food, communication, and reinforcements. Hassan sent emissaries to villages nearby, some openly, others discreetly, seeking agreements that benefited both sides. Villagers wary of Seljuk taxation found his proposals appealing. Those caught between rival clans saw potential stability in aligning with a stronghold governed by principles rather than shifting personal ambitions. As these alliances formed, the fortress took on a new role. People who once avoided its steep paths now climbed toward its gates carrying messages, grain, and news. With each exchange, Alamut drew closer to the world it intended to reshape. Those who visited witnessed the discipline of its inhabitants, the structured instruction in doctrine, the drills conducted on narrow terraces, the quiet dedication that marked Hassan's leadership. Word returned to the valleys describing not a band of fugitives, but a purposeful society. Hassan's presence guided every development. He rarely left the fortress, but his influence extended well beyond its walls. Reports from emissaries allowed him to adjust strategies in remote districts. Internal concerns reached him through counselors entrusted with maintaining order. His method of leadership relied on clarity. Everyone knew their role, their responsibilities, and the greater mission they supported. This clarity distinguished Alamut from the disordered politics of the Seljuk court, where rapid successions, rivalries, and shifting alliances often paralyzed decision-making. Meanwhile, those same Seljuk officials were beginning to sense that something unusual was taking shape in the north. At first, they dismissed the seizure of Alamut as an isolated incident, an inconvenience to be corrected when priorities allowed. But rumors accumulated. Villagers spoke of a man who had turned a remote fortress into a gathering point for dissidents. Merchants mentioned increased movement along mountain tracks. Some Seljuk officers, recalling earlier Ismaili activities, warned their superiors that this development could not be ignored. By the time the empire reacted, the moment of opportunity had already passed. The first punitive expedition moved toward the region with confidence. Seljuk armies had long experience in crushing uprisings. A single mountain stronghold seemed an insignificant obstacle, yet geography dictated the battle before soldiers even approached Alamut. The narrow paths leading to the fortress allowed only small groups to advance at once. Archers positioned along concealed terraces forced attackers to retreat repeatedly. Supply lines stretched over treacherous terrain. Winter threatened to trap armies in valleys where forage was scarce. Each difficulty magnified the next, and by the end of the campaign, the Seljuks withdrew without achieving any meaningful objective. Their failure transformed the perception of Alamut. Communities that had once observed Hassan's rise with caution began to recognize the fortress as a serious power. Its people had withstood an empire's first blow. More villages aligned themselves with the movement. Some did so out of sympathy for the Ismaili cause. Others sought protection from Seljuk reprisals. Even distant supporters, connected through the Dawa, sent cautious congratulations, acknowledging that Hassan had accomplished what many believed impossible. These victories strengthened internal discipline. Hassan emphasized the need for preparation, stockpiling grain, improving water channels, reinforcing walls, and training the garrison in coordinated defense. The fortress became a hive of activity. Stonemasons worked through long daylight hours, smiths produced weapons and tools, and trainees practiced maneuvering in tight spaces. Nothing inside Alamut was left to chance. Every corridor served a logistical purpose. Every terrace could be converted into a defensive post. Order bound the community together. Beyond Alamut, other fortresses had begun falling under Ismaili influence. Missionaries reached outlying districts in Kuistan, and some local commanders embraced the cause willingly. Others resisted at first, but found their positions untenable when faced with growing popular support. In time, fortified strongholds across the region formed a loose chain of cooperation. While each castle retained autonomy, all looked to Hassan for direction. His leadership unified what had once been fragmented. Seljuk officials felt the pressure of these developments. Advisors debated how to respond, whether through massive military campaigns, targeted arrests, or political negotiation. Their indecision favored Hassan. Every hesitation gave him space to fortify, organize, and expand. The empire, as large as it was, could not deploy armies everywhere at once. Conflicts on other frontiers required attention. Court factions that vied for authority hindered coordinated action. Internal problems drained resources long before they reached the mountains. Still, Hassan knew that Alamut could not rely solely on stone walls and mountain paths. The Seljuks remained powerful, and their armies could eventually overwhelm even the strongest positions if provoked enough times. The movement needed a strategy that avoided open war, yet influenced imperial decisions. Hassan understood that the empire's strength rested not only in soldiers, but in the decisions of a handful of individuals, viziers, governors, military commanders. If those individuals could be pressured, persuaded, or neutralized, the Seljuk advance might be slowed or redirected. Inside the fortress, discussions examined ways to accompany doctrine with strategy. How should the movement respond to future threats? What methods could protect isolated communities? How might the empire be made to hesitate before launching another campaign? These questions did not yet have definitive answers, but the seeds of later tactics began forming in this environment. The fortress became not only a military refuge and spiritual center, but a laboratory for political innovation. While Hassan contemplated future challenges, his followers strengthened internal cohesion. Lessons in doctrine emphasized loyalty to Nizar's lineage, reinforcing a narrative that legitimized their break from rival Ismaili factions. Disciples internalized not only theological principles, but a shared sense of destiny, a belief that their survival served a greater purpose than personal safety. This worldview cultivated unity at a depth that mere force could not achieve. In the Seljuk capital, the situation grew more complicated. Conflicts among princes and advisors destabilized decision-making. Rivalries erupted at court, each side accusing the other of incompetence or corruption. These struggles distracted from frontier issues, especially those involving remote mountain fortresses. While the empire debated internal matters, Hassan moved steadily, unseen by most, but shaping events with calculated precision. Over time, the seizure of Alamut became something greater than a local rebellion. It marked the birth of a miniature state, one without the sprawling cities of great empires, but possessed of something more potent: unity, discipline, and strategic vision. Hassan's leadership, grounded in conviction and sharpened by adversity, turned his followers into a community capable of operating under immense pressure. the fortress that once changed hands quietly now stood as the center of a movement determined to survive the world's hostility. Seljuk generals would return, campaigns would resume, armies would attempt what earlier forces had failed to accomplish. But Alamut, fortified in both structure and purpose, would not collapse under the first storm. Hassan had secured what he needed: a stronghold resilient against imperial assault, a network loyal to its mission, and a foundation upon which new strategies could emerge. What lay ahead would challenge this foundation, pushing the movement into methods that would terrify adversaries and reshape political dynamics across Persia and Syria. But for now, the fortress stood firm, its walls bearing witness to the moment when a wandering preacher transformed belief into a base of revolution. Long before dawn broke over the limestone ridges of the Syrian coast, flickers of torchlight crawled along the mountain paths, leading toward a citadel called Masyaf. The fortress stood atop a crag overlooking orchards, scattered villages, and distant plains where crusader banners fluttered among the ruins of past battles. Travelers who passed through these lands often spoke of the region as one of crossroads and contradictions. Latin knights rode beside Armenian merchants, Arab emirs negotiated truces with Franks, and Turkish commanders fought one another while watching foreign armies build new castles on their borders. Here, certainty was ephemeral. Alliances shifted with the seasons. A single rumor could alter the fate of a town. This landscape, fractured, competitive, and unpredictable, created an opening for the Nizari movement to expand beyond Persia. Emissaries had traveled westward even before Alamut reached full consolidation, assessing whether pockets of support might exist among mountain communities. They found in Syria a political environment ripe for careful influence. No single power dominated the region. Seljuk princes controlled some districts, Crusader lords others, and small local dynasties maintained their own authority wherever the terrain allowed. Each force competed for tribute, allegiance, or survival. For a movement accustomed to navigating hostile environments, Syria offered possibilities Persia could not. The earliest Nizari footholds in Syria were modest. A few small fortresses, purchased or negotiated through alliances, provided shelter for missionaries who worked quietly among villages. These outposts lacked the formidable defenses of Alamut, but they offered proximity to important political centers: Antioch, Aleppo, Damascus, and the Crusader ports along the Mediterranean. From these positions, Nizari representatives observed the shifting relationships between local lords, noting who opposed Seljuk influence, who resisted Crusader expansion, and who might be open to cooperation. For a time, these footholds existed simply as part of a wider network, their strength dependent on the counsel and resources of Alamut. But during the mid-12th century, a figure arrived who would redefine the entire movement's presence in Syria: Rashid al-Din Sinan. His origins within the Persian network prepared him for leadership long before he set foot on Syrian soil. Sinan had already developed a reputation for discipline and strategic insight, qualities that drew the attention of senior Nizari leaders. When Alamut sought someone capable of overseeing activity in the West, someone who could balance subtle diplomacy with decisive action, Sinan emerged as the ideal candidate. His journey across the mountains and deserts toward Masyaf marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where the Syrian frontier would gain a leader whose name would echo in chronicles and legends alike. Upon arriving, Sinan encountered a region defined by tension. Crusader states pressed inland in search of resources and influence. Muslim rulers, fragmented by rivalries, struggled to resist them. Local emirs balanced loyalty to larger powers with their own ambitions. Every authority faced multiple threats, and none could afford to ignore the unique capabilities the Nizaris offered: information, covert communication, and a readiness to act where armies hesitated. Sinan's leadership style adapted seamlessly to these conditions. He moved among the Syrian fortresses, Masyaf, Kadmus, Al-Kaf, establishing order, assessing strengths and weaknesses, and cultivating loyalty. His arrival restored coherence to communities that had previously operated with limited coordination. He reinforced doctrine while encouraging flexibility, recognizing that survival in Syria required a blend of resolve and adaptability. Under his guidance, the fortress network developed not only as a defensive system, but as a political tool capable of influencing regional affairs. News of his effectiveness spread quickly through the mountains. Local villagers reported seeing him meet with tribal leaders, monks from Christian monasteries, and envoys from distant cities. While he never abandoned the doctrinal foundation of the Nizari movement, he understood that survival required more than internal unity. It required maneuvering through the ambitions of others. Sinan's capacity to navigate these complexities earned him a reputation distinct from Hassan's. Where Hassan built from discipline and doctrine, Sinan built from presence and precision. These qualities drew attention from Crusader and Muslim leaders alike. Some sought alliances with the Nizaris, hoping to secure their neutrality or enlist their help against rivals. Others viewed the movement with suspicion, wary of its unpredictable influence. Among these figures rose one whose future would intersect with Sinan's repeatedly: Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the military commander destined to unify much of Syria and Egypt under his rule. At the time of Sinan's arrival, Salah ad-Din had not yet reached the height of his power. But his ambitions were clear. He sought to stabilize the region, eliminate rival claims, and prepare for campaigns against Crusader strongholds. His rise threatened every faction that relied on the fractured nature of Syrian politics, Nizari or otherwise. Sinan observed his growing influence with careful attention. The question was not whether conflict between them would occur. It was only a matter of when and under what circumstances. Before these confrontations unfolded, Sinan strengthened the identity of the Syrian branch. He refined the training of local fidai, integrating them into a culture shaped by the rugged environment and the political volatility of the region. Their missions required navigating Crusader cities, Seljuk courts, and independent lordships, each with its own customs and defenses. Training adapted accordingly. Operatives learned the mannerisms of Latin monks, the dialects of coastal towns, and the etiquette of princely courts. Every assignment demanded more than execution. It required understanding. At the same time, Sinan cultivated an aura around his leadership. Visitors described him as calm, deliberate, and unyielding. Stories spread of private audiences, where he spoke with a quiet authority that commanded immediate respect. The uncertainty surrounding his origins only enhanced his image. Some claimed he possessed extraordinary knowledge. Others whispered that he could predict betrayal or foresee danger. These tales were not crafted by Sinan, yet they expanded his influence far beyond the walls of Masyaf. As months turned into years, the Nizari presence in Syria became impossible to ignore. Envoys seeking alliances passed through mountain passes to meet with Sinan's representatives. Crusader lords near the coast debated whether neutrality with the Nizaris offered more security than confrontation. Muslim emirs weighed alliances based not only on immediate advantage, but on the potential consequences of antagonizing a group capable of striking unpredictably. Sinan exploited this uncertainty with remarkable skill. He rarely moved against an enemy without necessity. Yet when action became unavoidable, his decisions sent clear messages. A targeted strike against a rival could halt a campaign, destabilize a siege, or remind ambitious leaders that power in Syria could shift with a single act. Each mission, whether executed or merely rumored, expanded the Nizari reputation. This reputation extended even to distant courts, where travelers recounted stories of a mysterious figure ruling from the mountains. The West would later call him the Old Man of the Mountain, a title shaped by myth rather than fact, yet rooted in the impression he left on all who encountered him. While Hassan had shaped the doctrinal foundation of the movement, Sinan shaped its legend. Beneath this growing mystique, the Syrian branch developed structures that mirrored Alamut while adapting to local needs. Fortresses coordinated supply routes, maintained defensive readiness, and communicated through trusted couriers who traveled at night or disguised themselves among merchants. The region's geography, steep cliffs, narrow passes, and thick forests, provided natural protection for these operations. Each stronghold served as both sanctuary and watchtower, observing the movements of crusader armies, Seljuk detachments, and local militias. As Sinan's authority grew stronger, the fortress of Masyaf evolved into a center of strategy. From its towers, scouts surveyed the surrounding countryside. Its halls hosted emissaries who traveled long distances to exchange news. Its armories stocked weapons not for open warfare, but for precision, the hallmark of Nizari operations. And in the chambers where Sinan met with his commanders, the boundaries of influence extended beyond Syria, linking the region to the broader Nizari world. By the time Salah ad-Din began consolidating power against his rivals, the Syrian Nizaris had become a force neither Crusader nor Muslim rulers could ignore. Some viewed them as dangerous allies, others as cautious neighbors, and some as potential threats. Yet Sinan maintained control through balance, offering neutrality when beneficial, cooperation when advantageous, and resistance when necessary. This equilibrium prepared the region for confrontations that would soon involve some of the most influential figures of the era. As military campaigns intensified, fortresses changed hands, and alliances shifted, the Syrian Nizaris under Sinan would navigate every development with the same disciplined precision that defined their rise. The Syrian frontier had given the movement space to grow. Under Sinan, it gave them something more: identity, presence, and a reputation that would shape how rulers across the Middle East calculated every decision. Even as Sinan solidified his authority in the mountains, conflict churned across Syria with increasing intensity. Borders expanded and contracted in rapid succession. Towns changed rulers in the span of weeks, and envoys traveled constantly between courts, carrying proposals for truces that rarely outlasted the ink used to write them. In this unsettled environment, the Syrian Nizaris adapted quickly, shaping their strategy around the unpredictability that defined the region. Their strength did not lie in commanding vast armies or controlling sweeping plains. It lay in timing, discretion, and an understanding that even the smallest action could influence the momentum of entire campaigns. Local lords recognized this pattern. A single misstep could draw the Nizaris' attention, while a slight gesture of respect could secure years of peace. As a result, diplomacy with Sinan rarely followed formal protocol. Agreements often emerged from casual meetings in secluded groves or exchanges at night along mountain paths. Some rulers sought temporary neutrality. Others requested mediation in disputes. These interactions varied widely, but each one expanded the Nizari's understanding of the political landscape and allowed Sinan to position his followers with precision. Meanwhile, Crusader states along the coast observed the rise of the Nizaris with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Their castles overlooked trade routes leading into the mountains, and their leaders monitored any force capable of altering the balance of power. Envoys from Latin courts occasionally visited Masyaf or passed messages through intermediaries. These contacts did not represent alliances, but rather attempts to understand a faction that moved quietly through territories where traditional armies struggled to operate. Sinan received these messengers with a calm that left strong impressions. He offered neither hostility nor eagerness, only measured responses that revealed no more than necessary. Salah ad-Din's ascent shifted the dynamics further. As he expanded his authority across Egypt and Syria, absorbing territories weakened by internal disputes, he approached his campaigns with an overarching vision: unification. This ambition threatened every group that had relied on regional fragmentation to maintain autonomy. For the Nizaris, Salah ad-Din's rise demanded close observation. His methods differed from those of earlier leaders. He relied less on unpredictable alliances and more on calculated consolidation. His determination left little space for independent enclaves to flourish unchecked. Sinan met this challenge with remarkable steadiness. He neither provoked confrontation nor conceded to pressure. Instead, he evaluated the intentions behind Salah ad-Din's every move. Scouts monitored Ayyubid forces near frontier towns. Couriers tracked shifting alliances among Syrian emirs. Local supporters reported how Salah ad-Din's envoys treated mountain communities. This information shaped Sinan's decisions that reflected restraint even when tensions escalated. The first major clash between the two leaders emerged not from direct hostility, but from competing interests. As Salah ad-Din attempted to extend his control into northern Syria, he sought to bring local fortresses under his authority. Some of these fortresses maintained ties to the Nizaris. Their allegiances complicated Salah ad-Din's efforts and drew the attention of commanders who urged him to eliminate the threat. Sinan responded by deploying emissaries to negotiate terms, but those conversations rarely resolved the underlying tension. The mere presence of Nizari strongholds obstructed any straightforward path to unification. Eventually, Fidari operations intersected with Salah ad-Din's campaigns. 2 attempts on his life occurred, one during a military encampment, another while he laid siege to a fortress. Accounts described Fidai infiltrating tents under the cover of night, or mingling among workers repairing siege equipment. These actions, regardless of objective, illustrated the Nizari's ability to reach commanders even in the heart of secured positions. Soldiers responded with heightened vigilance, guards doubled their watches, and commanders questioned whether secrecy could ever be guaranteed. Despite these developments, Sinan did not seek prolonged war. He recognized that direct conflict with Salah ad-Din would strain the movement's resources and risk retaliation beyond what the Syrian Nizaris could manage. Instead, he sought a controlled resolution, one that preserved autonomy without provoking further escalation. Envoys eventually arranged a meeting, perhaps not face-to-face, but through messages delivered with careful wording. The outcome was pragmatic. Both sides agreed to reduce hostilities. Neither would threaten the other unless provoked. This arrangement allowed Sinan to maintain his strongholds while enabling Salah ad-Din to focus his energies on campaigns against the Crusaders. This negotiated equilibrium shaped how the Syrian Nizaris operated in subsequent years. They avoided unnecessarily entangling themselves in broader conflicts, while maintaining influence through selective intervention. Crusader lords, too, recognized this pattern. Some chose to maintain neutrality. Others attempted to cultivate relationships with the Nizaris to stabilize their frontier positions. Under Sinan's guidance, these interactions remained consistent with the movement's broader strategy: avoid open wars, reinforce autonomy, and influence events without exposing the community to catastrophic retaliation. Inside Masyaf, daily life reflected this balance. The fortress blended normalcy with heightened readiness. Farmers tended mountain fields. Artisans supplied tools and provisions. Scholars taught doctrine in shaded courtyards. Yet beneath this calm lay constant vigilance. Scouts monitored distant roads. Fidai trained on secluded terraces, and messages carried across Syria returned with reports of political shifts. Sinan maintained a central role in interpreting these developments. His decisions shaped the movement's path: when to intervene, when to withdraw, and when to allow events to unfold without interference. His reputation continued to grow beyond Syria. Travelers from Damascus, Aleppo, and the coastal Crusader ports carried stories about him. Stories shaped by admiration, fear, curiosity, or misunderstanding. Some claimed he possessed extraordinary insight, able to predict treachery before it occurred. Others believed he communicated with Alamut through secretive methods unavailable to ordinary leaders. These accounts varied, but they shared a common theme. Sinan represented something distinct, something that blurred the line between political actor and symbol. Under his leadership, the Syrian Nizaris developed a sense of identity that complemented the Persian heartland while remaining uniquely shaped by their environment. Their fortresses reflected the rugged character of the northern mountains. Their strategies adapted to the fragmented politics of the Levant, and their reputation grew independently of the legends surrounding Hassan. While Alamut provided doctrinal foundation, Masyaf gave the movement a voice in the west. The Syrian branch's presence influenced alliances among Muslim rulers as much as it shaped Crusader strategies. Some emirs sought Nizari neutrality before launching campaigns against their rivals. Others feared provoking them. Even Crusader commanders, who had no intention of cooperating with the Nizaris, reconsidered travel routes or tightened palace security whenever rumors circulated about Fidai activity. The psychological impact of the movement extended far beyond the number of operatives within their ranks. As decades passed, Sinan's authority remained steady. He adapted to new challenges, mediated internal disputes, and guided the Syrian Nizaris through storms of changing leadership across the region. Crusader kingdoms fractured and reformed. Ayyubid princes inherited territories, quarreled or sought consolidation. Yet amid these shifting alliances, the Nizaris maintained their foothold. Their autonomy held firm, not because they possessed overwhelming power, but because they mastered the art of survival in a region where certainty was scarce. By the time Sinan's influence reached its height, the Syrian frontier had become more than a strategic expansion of the Nizari world. It had become a testing ground for political adaptation, and a landscape where myth and reality intertwined closely. Through discipline, calculated diplomacy, and the careful use of the Fidai, Sinan ensured that the Nizaris would remain integral to the region's political fabric. His rise represented not only the consolidation of a branch, but the maturation of the movement itself. Persia had forged its ideology. Syria forged its legend. Across the plains of Central Asia, where the horizon stretched unbroken and the wind carried dust in great sweeping arcs, horsemen rode beneath banners marked with the symbols of a rising empire. These riders came from lands farther east than most Persians had ever seen, regions of steppe and forest, where discipline and mobility shaped the lives of entire nations. Their presence in the heart of Asia marked the beginning of an upheaval that would eventually shake every citadel of the Islamic world, including the mountain strongholds of the Nizaris. Long before Hulagu Khan's armies appeared near Persian borders, rumors of Mongol power traveled like distant thunder. Merchants returning from caravans that crossed toward China described cities reduced to ashes and kingdoms that vanished in a single campaign. Soldiers who survived earlier clashes spoke of tactics that defied conventional warfare, rapid maneuvers, disciplined coordination, and relentless pursuit. Yet what terrified listeners most were accounts of Mongol expectations, total submission or total destruction. They accepted neither delay nor ambiguity. A ruler could not negotiate halfway. Loyalty had to be unquestionable. Resistance brought consequences so severe that entire regions emptied rather than face their armies. These stories reached Persia at a time when the region was already strained. The once cohesive Seljuk structure had fractured into rival principalities. Local rulers governed territories without coordinating with one another. Larger cities like Isfahan, Ray, and Nishapur found themselves vulnerable to shifting alliances, economic disruptions, and conflicts between neighboring warlords. The political landscape lacked a central authority capable of orchestrating a unified response to external threat. For the Nizaris, these conditions presented both danger and opportunity. Alamut and its surrounding fortresses had withstood decades of pressure from Seljuk forces, but the empire's fragmentation created pockets of relief. Governors who might once have led anti-Nizari campaigns now lacked resources or motivation. Others focused on their own immediate rivals and left the mountains untouched. Hassan's successors recognized this shift and used it to consolidate the movement's internal structures, refine training, and strengthen alliances across Persia and Syria. But this period of relative calm did not last. As the Mongol Empire expanded westward, envoys arrived in Persia bearing commands from the Great Khan. Some local rulers submitted immediately, calculating that obedience offered the only plausible chance of survival. Others hesitated, weighing pride against prudence. Their indecision often sealed their fate. Mongol armies advanced with methodical precision, overwhelming fortresses and cities one by one. For communities accustomed to the fluctuating strength of regional powers, this new force seemed unstoppable. The Nizaris watched these developments with growing concern. Their fortresses were strong, but their numbers small. Mountain terrain favored defense, but Mongol forces had already proven capable of overcoming even the most daunting obstacles. Intelligence gathered from traders and allied communities indicated that the Mongols possessed siege engineers from conquered lands, armies that moved rapidly across harsh terrain, and strategies that adapted quickly to unfamiliar environments. A fortress like Alamut, though formidable, could not rely on isolation alone. At this time, leadership within the Nizari movement passed through several hands. Hassan's successors sought to maintain the structure he had established while responding to new political realities. Communities in Kuistan, Rudbar, and other districts faced the challenge of balancing their own needs with directives from Alamut. Leaders issued guidance on fortification, resource storage, and communication methods in anticipation of greater threats. The movement's cohesion, long its strongest asset, now became essential for survival. Years before Hulagu's specific campaign began, Mongol interest in the Nizaris emerged indirectly. Some Mongol administrators, influenced by their Islamic advisors, viewed the Nizari state with suspicion. Stories about the Fidai circulated through the courts of Karakoram, magnified by rumor and misinterpretation. Envoys described targeted killings of rulers and commanders, each carried out by operatives who moved with precision and vanished without trace. To Mongol leaders, such actions represented not simple political maneuvering, but defiance, a refusal to live within the clear hierarchy Mongol rule demanded. These concerns intensified after the ascension of Munka Khan. His mandate involved eliminating potential threats before launching campaigns into the Middle East. Among his priorities were the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and the Nizari strongholds in Persia. Both represented forms of authority that might resist Mongol rule. As a result, Munka instructed his brother Hulagu to move west with a force large enough to crush any opposition that stood in his way. Hulagu approached this task not as a single campaign, but as a systematic restructuring of the region. He brought engineers skilled in siegecraft, commanders experienced in long-term operations, and logisticians capable of moving supplies across vast distances. The size of his armies dwarfed anything the Nizaris had encountered before. Reports of his preparations traveled quickly along trade routes and reached even remote mountain villages. The scale of the expedition suggested that submission, negotiation, or resistance would soon require clear decisions. The first Nizari responses attempted diplomacy. Envoys carried messages expressing respect and seeking peaceful relations. They offered tribute or assurances of neutrality. Hulagu received these gestures but continued his advance. The Mongol approach did not easily accommodate divided authority or independent enclaves. From their perspective, a fortified mountain network capable of covert operations posed an unacceptable risk. Internal debates within the Nizari leadership reflected the gravity of the situation. Some argued for continued negotiation, hoping to demonstrate that the movement did not seek conflict. Others favored preparing the strongholds for prolonged sieges. A number of commanders voiced concerns that resisting the Mongols directly would provoke devastation beyond anything Persia had yet witnessed. These differing viewpoints revealed a movement grappling with a threat it had never encountered before. Meanwhile, fortresses across the region strengthened their defenses. Supplies were stored in stone chambers. Water systems were inspected and reinforced. Tunnels offering alternative escape routes were cleared or expanded. Messengers carried instructions to distant communities, urging them to prepare for the arrival of Mongol detachments. For the first time, the Nizaris faced an enemy whose reach extended beyond geography, whose strategies had destroyed empires far larger than the Seljuks. On the Mongol side, Hulagu's reconnaissance teams assessed the mountain terrain. Scouts mapped routes that could support the movement of siege engines. Engineers constructed equipment capable of striking from positions far below fortress walls. Their preparations revealed the difference between earlier Seljuk attempts and the forces now approaching. Hulagu did not expect quick victories. He planned for methodical campaigns designed to wear down resistance, exploit weaknesses, and erode morale. As the Mongol armies advanced deeper into Persia, communities across the region experienced the first tremors of the impending storm. Rumors of massacres, razed cities, and mass deportations spread quickly. Each report increased the urgency felt within Nizari strongholds. Leaders understood that time was limited. Negotiations continued, but their tone grew increasingly cautious. Even those who had once believed diplomacy could spare the movement now questioned whether such hopes were realistic. The stage was set for confrontation. The Nizaris, whose survival had depended on discipline, secrecy, and strategic precision, now faced a force unlike any they had encountered. Hulagu's campaign did not begin with a single decisive battle. It began with the knowledge that once the Mongols targeted a region, resistance became a matter not merely of courage, but of endurance. A storm had begun to gather over Persia, and the mountain fortresses of the Nizaris stood directly in its path. Chroniclers would later describe the Mongol advance as a tide, steady, unbroken, and indifferent to obstacles. But for the communities who witnessed its approach, it felt like the arrival of something far less predictable. Riders appeared first on the distant edges of the horizon, then along riverbanks and caravan routes that had once been safe for merchants and travelers. Villages emptied long before soldiers reached their gates. Fortresses that once resisted regional warlords surrendered at the sight of dust clouds rising from advancing columns. Word traveled ahead of every Mongol detachment, and in each retelling, the stories grew sharper. Uncompromising demands, swift retribution, and a discipline that left no room for negotiation once a verdict had been issued. As these reports spread, Nizari leaders recognized the need for unified strategy. Their fortresses stretched across regions with different environmental and political conditions. Some strongholds guarded narrow valleys, others perched on cliffs overlooking plains. Each fortress commander understood local terrain intimately. Yet the scale of the Mongol threat required coordination beyond regional familiarity. Messengers moved between Alamut, Lamasar, Girdkur, and outlying districts carrying instructions drafted after intense debate. The movement had survived Seljuk pressure through careful timing and targeted action. Now it faced an enemy that confronted resistance with total force. One of the earliest decisions involved reducing visibility. Mountain communities that typically interacted with nearby markets shifted their activities inward. Supplies were gathered quietly. Routes used for transporting grain or tools changed to avoid possible detection. While the Nizari fortresses had survived sieges for decades, self-sufficiency became more urgent than ever. Granaries filled to capacity, and water systems, critical to sustaining long periods of isolation, were cleaned and reinforced. Engineers within the movement examined walls, repaired stonework, and prepared fallback positions in case outer defenses failed. At Alamut, senior administrators assessed diplomatic options. Envoys had been dispatched earlier, but their reports offered little hope. Mongol court officials received them, yet the responses lacked clarity or assurance. Tribute was accepted without commitments to peace. Respectful gestures went unanswered. These ambiguous reactions fueled internal disagreement. Some leaders argued that concessions might buy time. Others believed that delay would only strengthen the Mongols' preparations. The debate did not fracture the movement, but it revealed how unprecedented the situation had become. Meanwhile, the first Mongol detachments encountered fortified villages and strongholds outside Nizari territories. Their actions followed a familiar pattern: demands for submission, followed by immediate assault if negotiations faltered. These early campaigns demonstrated that resistance, no matter how justified, led to devastating consequences. Survivors fled along mountain paths, carrying warnings that confirmed the worst fears circulating through Nizari councils. Stories of entire towns reduced to ash reached Alamut and its neighboring fortresses, transforming caution into urgency. Inside the Nizari strongholds, daily routines shifted to reflect the looming threat. Armories, normally quiet except during training cycles, saw constant activity. Fletchers worked day and night crafting arrows. Blacksmiths forged spearheads and reinforced armor plates. Even those with no martial role participated in preparations, repairing walls, storing provisions, or delivering materials between workshops. The sense of shared purpose unified communities that had long understood the cost of survival. Beyond the mountains, Mongol reconnaissance expanded. Hulagu's commanders mapped river crossings, measured distances between mountain passes, and identified paths where siege equipment could travel. Their scouts approached Nizari territories cautiously, aware that unfamiliar terrain demanded careful planning. When they encountered resistance, they withdrew to report, rather than risk unnecessary loss. This methodical approach revealed something unsettling. The Mongols did not treat Nizari fortresses as minor obstacles. They viewed them as targets requiring specialized strategies. At the same time, internal doubts emerged among Nizari leaders in the farthest districts. Some wondered whether the Mongols truly saw the movement as a central threat, or whether the fortresses stood simply in the path of a larger imperial campaign. Others questioned the wisdom of resisting a power that had crushed armies far larger than any force the Nizaris could gather. These concerns did not reflect wavering loyalty, but pragmatic fear. The movement had endured for decades by making calculated decisions. Now calculation offered no comforting answers. Diplomacy continued despite uncertainty. New envoys traveled with messages crafted to demonstrate cooperation. They carried explanations of the movement's history, assurances of peaceful intent, and offers of tribute. In some cases, Mongol representatives responded politely. Yet these gestures lacked decisive commitments. The Nizaris understood that while negotiation remained possible, nothing guaranteed that it would spare their strongholds. Tension grew when information reached Alamut, suggesting that some advisors in the Mongol court viewed the movement's existence as incompatible with Mongol rule. These advisors, often individuals familiar with Persian politics, described the Nizaris as capable of striking without warning. Their assessments, shaped by fear and misunderstanding, contributed to the perception that the mountain fortresses posed a threat that had to be eliminated before the Mongols could secure their authority in the region. Across Nizari territories, leaders sought to maintain morale while preparing for multiple scenarios. Some fortresses were instructed to endure siege as long as possible. Others were advised to negotiate and submit if overwhelmed. The movement had no illusion of matching Mongol numbers, but it hoped to delay their advance, force negotiations, or divert attention toward other targets. The priority was preservation of the community, even if strongholds were lost. As months passed, the first major Mongol operations in Persia revealed the scale of the challenge ahead. Cities that resisted fell rapidly. Those that surrendered often saw their elites replaced and their structures absorbed into the Mongol administrative system. These transformations demonstrated that the Mongols did not merely conquer. They restructured political landscapes to prevent future threats. For the Nizaris, this pattern carried clear implications. Even if individual fortresses survived initial campaigns, long-term independence seemed impossible without concessions. Inside the mountain strongholds, discussions shifted toward long-term survival. Leaders questioned whether relocating communities might preserve lives. Some suggested dispersing followers across regions less likely to draw Mongol attention. Others argued that abandoning strongholds would mean relinquishing the movement's identity, weakening unity, and leaving communities exposed to persecution from other powers. The debates never escalated into division, but they underscored the difficult choices ahead. Hulagu's preparations intensified. Siege engineers who had served in campaigns across Central Asia arrived with specialized equipment. Artillery crews transported counterweight machinery designed to breach thick walls. Supply convoys followed behind, ensuring that campaigns could continue through multiple seasons. From the Mongol perspective, success required coordination, patience, and overwhelming force, qualities they had demonstrated repeatedly in earlier conquests. By the time the Mongol vanguard reached the outskirts of Nizari territories, the storm had fully gathered. Riders approached the valleys below key fortresses, testing defenses and measuring response times. Their scouts noted the movement of sentries on watchtowers and listened for signals echoing along cliffs. These observations informed detailed plans for the campaign ahead. Within Alamut, leaders recognized that diplomacy and preparation had reached their limit. Negotiations continued, but with no assurance of safety. The movement's strongholds had become more than refuges. They represented obligations to the communities they sheltered. Abandoning them without resistance would endanger villages throughout the region. Yet defending them meant confronting a force that overwhelmed every enemy it faced. As the first Mongol detachments advanced along the mountain routes, it became clear that the moment the Nizaris had feared for years had arrived. Their strongholds stood ready. Their people were prepared. But no amount of readiness could guarantee the future. The Mongol storm had reached the foothills of the Nizari world, and what followed would determine not only the fate of their fortresses, but the endurance of their entire way of life. High in the mountains, where winter clouds drifted low enough to brush the battlements and the fortress paths narrowed into ledges carved from sheer stone, a new kind of discipline began to take shape within Alamut. The fortress had changed hands quietly, but what emerged inside its walls would transform the political landscape of Persia and Syria with a force far greater than its modest numbers could suggest. Hassan understood that stone walls alone could not defend a movement surrounded by enemies on all sides. If the Seljuks returned in strength, no fortress, no matter how steep its approaches, could guarantee survival. What the movement needed was an idea sharper than any blade, carried by individuals who embodied unwavering loyalty. In this environment, a select group began to stand apart from the rest of Alamut's inhabitants. They came from nearby villages, from distant mountain communities, and occasionally from cities where they had lived quietly under Seljuk rule. Some were young men, raised in the shadow of imperial crackdowns. Others were older, shaped by experiences that left them searching for purpose. What united them was not age or origin, but devotion, an acceptance that their lives belonged to a mission larger than their own fate. These individuals would eventually be known by a name that carried both reverence and fear: the Fidai, the ones who were willing to sacrifice. Their formation did not begin with grand ceremonies or dramatic vows. It began with silence, long periods spent in contemplation, instruction, and observation. Within Alamut's inner halls, senior members of the movement introduced recruits to doctrines that blended spiritual conviction with practical responsibility. Texts were studied not as abstract philosophy, but as guides for living with clarity and discipline. Recruits learned to separate personal desire from collective necessity, to act when commanded and refrain when needed, and to interpret obedience as a path towards spiritual fulfillment rather than submission. These early sessions shaped more than belief. They sharpened the recruit's sense of purpose. Some arrived filled with anger over injustices endured under Seljuk rule. Others felt only curiosity, drawn to Hassan's reputation. But as they progressed, their motivations aligned. The movement did not require blind fury. It required precision. Every act carried consequences for the entire community, and every decision reflected on the doctrine they served. Emotion could motivate, but only discipline could sustain. Once this foundation was established, training expanded beyond scripture and discussion. The narrow terraces where guards once drilled transformed into areas for physical conditioning. Recruits practiced balance along ledges, learned to navigate uneven terrain quickly, and rehearsed climbing techniques essential for infiltrating or escaping fortified positions. They were taught to move silently, to endure long hours of stillness, and to operate in environments where a single mistake meant failure. The mountains themselves became part of their education, teachers of patience, resilience, and awareness. Instruction included more subtle skills as well. Disguise became an essential part of their training. Recruits practiced adopting the mannerisms of merchants, servants, or scholars. They learned how to blend into bustling marketplaces without drawing attention, how to travel through enemy territories without suspicion, and how to approach a target in plain sight. This skill demanded not only technique, but psychological understanding. A perfect disguise required immersion in another identity, sometimes for days or weeks. The movement valued patience as much as physical ability. Communication formed another crucial element of training. Messages had to pass across hostile territories without interception. Recruits memorized coded phrases, learned to embed meaning within ordinary conversation, and practiced conveying information through gestures or objects. A Fidari could not rely on written letters or obvious signals. Their survival depended on subtlety. In time, these methods became sophisticated enough to sustain networks across vast distances, connecting Alamut to fortresses in Kohistan and communities in Syria with remarkable efficiency. Throughout this process, Hassan remained present, not always physically, but through his influence. Senior instructors reported directly to him. Decisions about each recruit's progress, their assignments, and their readiness were made carefully. The movement could not risk errors. A premature deployment might compromise the entire network. Only those who demonstrated unwavering discipline, clarity of purpose, and absolute reliability advanced to the next stage. Outside Alamut, stories began to circulate about these individuals. Some described them as ascetics who renounced the world. Others portrayed them as fanatics who obeyed commands without hesitation. A few tales, whispers born of fear and misunderstanding, claimed that young recruits were shown visions or subjected to extreme trials. These stories traveled faster than truth, weaving a cloak of mystery around the movement's methods. Hassan did not correct them. Myth could protect the fortress as surely as stone. The most sensational rumors spread far beyond Persia. In distant courts, travelers whispered of hidden gardens, narcotic potions, and pledges sealed in blood. None of these reflected the disciplined reality of Alamut, but they captured imaginations precisely because they emphasized the impossible. How else could rulers explain the existence of individuals willing to face certain death with calm conviction? How else could an empire justify its inability to suppress such a small but effective force? Legends became explanations, and explanations became armor. Hassan recognized this advantage and allowed it to flourish without sanctioning or denying it. Inside the fortress, the psychological transformation of recruits took a different shape, steady, purposeful, grounded in doctrine rather than spectacle. Fidai learned to accept danger as a natural part of life. They understood that their actions carried significance beyond personal risk. Each assignment carried the potential to alter political dynamics across regions. The removal of a single vizier or commander could redirect imperial campaigns, ease pressure on persecuted communities, or delay invasions long enough for the movement to regroup. Such missions required not only courage, but clarity. By the time recruits completed their training, they had internalized a worldview that merged discipline with devotion. They became instruments of the movement's survival, not reckless attackers, but carefully deployed operatives. Their actions were calculated, not impulsive. Their missions targeted specific individuals whose influence threatened the existence of the Nizari community. These missions were risky, often fatal, but the Fidai accepted such outcomes. Their loyalty rested on a profound belief in the movement's future. The emergence of the Fidai changed how the Seljuks perceived the Ismaili threat. Until this point, the empire viewed the movement as a dissident religious group with regional influence. But as Fidai missions disrupted court politics, imperial officials recognized that they faced something far more coordinated. Panic spread among governors and viziers. Guards were doubled in palaces. Audiences became more restricted. Any stranger could be a disguised operative. The fear generated by uncertainty often exceeded the physical danger itself. This fear, unintended yet powerful, shifted the balance of power. Even when imperial armies prepared new campaigns, hesitation delayed their advance. Leaders questioned whether they might become targets. Courtiers debated whether supporting further military action was worth the personal risk. Rumors of Fidai presence spread whenever an official made a bold decision against the Nizaris. In this way, the movement exerted influence disproportionate to its numbers. While the world beyond Alamut interpreted these developments through sensational tales, within the fortress, the process remained measured. Hassan emphasized that missions must be justified, targeted, and purposeful. Each action required long preparation, careful assessment, and an understanding of consequences. The Fidari were not a tool for reckless disruption. They were a means of survival for a community surrounded by larger empires. As the movement expanded into Syria and fortified its presence there, the Fidai gained additional responsibilities. They served as guardians of doctrine, symbols of devotion, and connectors between distant strongholds. Their presence reinforced unity among communities separated by geography and danger. A single Fidai visiting a remote village could inspire confidence in the movement's stability and resolve. By the end of Hassan's early years at Alamut, the Fidai had become integral to the Nizari identity. They embodied the movement's ability to endure without armies, to influence without conquest, and to defend without walls. The world feared them because it could not understand them. Their existence defied the logic of conventional politics. Yet for Hassan and his followers, they represented something far simpler: the assurance that the movement would survive in a world that offered it no safe place. Their rise set the stage for events that would soon unfold across Persia and Syria, where rival powers, crusader lords, and local emirs would all confront a force that fought not for territory alone, but for the survival of an entire vision. Training within Alamut did not follow a fixed calendar. Seasons shaped the rhythm of daily life. Summer brought long hours on exposed terraces, while winter forced lessons into enclosed corridors warmed by braziers. Yet in every season, recruits pushed through routines that wore away hesitation until only clarity remained. Their transformation depended not only on doctrine or physical skill, but on consistency, small repeated actions that taught patience, control, and awareness. Even those who never advanced to the highest ranks absorbed habits that strengthened the community's resilience. One of the earliest focuses of advanced instruction involved understanding the political landscape beyond the mountains. Recruits studied accounts of Seljuk succession disputes, regional rivalries, and the ambitions of powerful viziers. They analyzed letters intercepted from imperial messengers, or reports carried by sympathizers traveling between cities. These lessons emphasized that knowledge was a form of defense. A single misjudgment, an underestimation of a governor, a misreading of a prince's intentions, could jeopardize entire communities depending on Alamut's protection. This study of politics also taught restraint. Hassan insisted that missions be directed only toward figures whose actions posed clear, imminent danger. Recruits learned that the movement did not exist to punish personal enemies or enact vengeance on behalf of individuals. Its purpose was survival. Every strike had to serve the longevity of the Nizari community. This principle distinguished Fidai operations from the vendettas common in the era. Their motives were strategic, not emotional. Another domain of instruction involved endurance. Quiet tests, simple yet revealing, evaluated how recruits reacted to stress and deprivation. Days spent in isolation, long treks through snow, tasks performed on minimal sleep. These challenges revealed who could maintain focus under pressure. Instructors observed not only physical responses, but the steadiness of the mind. A Fidai needed to remain composed even when surrounded by uncertainty or imminent danger. During these years, the fortress began adopting practices that would later define its reputation. Senior members taught recruits to memorize passages, instructions, or maps in detail, allowing them to travel without written documents. They practiced passing through market crowds without leaving strong impressions on observers. Some trained to mimic regional dialects. Others learned how to enter cities unnoticed by using the bustle of trade as cover. The diversity of skills reflected the movement's adaptability. Each recruit possessed strengths suited to particular roles. While the world outside imagined elaborate rituals, inside the fortress, the reality remained grounded. Recruits spoke often with their mentors, not with grand declarations, but with honest reflections about fear, expectation, and responsibility. These conversations helped shape the mindset needed for assignments where retreat was rarely possible. Their willingness to proceed, despite danger, emerged from belief and understanding, rather than coercion or spectacle. Yet as stories spread, the world interpreted their devotion differently. One account claimed that Alamut possessed gardens filled with delights, meant to persuade young men that martyrdom brought paradise. Another described intoxicants used to dull fear. None survived scrutiny. These tales reflected the anxieties of rulers who could not otherwise comprehend the effectiveness of a small, disciplined group. The more imaginative the legend, the easier it became to explain why traditional armies struggled to counter the Nizaris. Hassan's followers knew the truth, that their discipline came from teachings, instruction, and purpose. But many recognized the strategic advantage of allowing myths to circulate. Beyond exaggerations, more grounded rumors also emerged. Travelers from Dalam spoke of young men who practiced on narrow ridges until they could cross them even in darkness. Merchants reported seeing individuals who blended into marketplaces seamlessly until one day they vanished without warning. Officials in distant cities debated how to identify Fidai within their own ranks. These accounts, though less sensational, fueled a growing atmosphere of uncertainty. This uncertainty influenced politics as effectively as any blade. When advisors presented strategies for suppressing the Nizaris, their recommendations came with hesitation. Some feared becoming targets if they pressed too aggressively against Alamut. Others suspected their rivals might use accusations of sympathy or betrayal to undermine them. As a result, Seljuk officials often delayed decisions or minimized local tensions to avoid drawing attention to themselves. In several cases, governors tolerated Ismaili communities even when instructed to act, reasoning that provoking conflict could jeopardize their own positions. Inside Alamut, leadership monitored these developments carefully. Reports from cities and fortresses helped senior members identify potential threats before they grew too large. If a particular official gained influence and demonstrated hostility toward the movement, the council discussed whether intervention was necessary. Such decisions were never made hastily. The consequences of each action extended beyond the target. They affected families, towns, and political dynamics across the region. A clear distinction emerged between internal discipline and external influence. Within the fortress, unity depended on cooperation rather than intimidation. Teachers corrected mistakes without harsh punishment. Every member contributed to daily tasks, whether maintaining walls, tending stores, or assisting in instruction. These routines kept the community strong and stable. Outside the fortress, however, the movement's influence required more caution. Alliances could shift, loyalties could waver, and conditions could change rapidly. The Fidai operated in this space, an environment of unpredictability, where swift, targeted action could protect vulnerable communities. In time, the presence of Fidai reached Syria, where political tensions between Crusader states, Seljuk princes, and local emirs created opportunities and dangers in equal measure. Emissaries from Alamut traveled west to assess whether a permanent foothold could be established. Their efforts laid the groundwork for a network that would eventually link the Persian heartland to the Syrian frontier. This expansion increased the movement's reach, but it also demanded higher levels of coordination. The more territories involved, the greater the need for reliable messengers and disciplined operatives capable of moving between distant strongholds. Hassan recognized that the movement would not survive if it relied on a small group alone. The Fidai represented a tool, but only one. Their existence strengthened the movement's capacity to navigate hostile politics, but they were not an army, nor did Hassan intend them to become one. The Nizari state required farmers, administrators, teachers, and negotiators as much as it needed operatives. Internal cohesion mattered as much as outward impact. Stability was essential for long-term survival. Still, the Fidai came to symbolize the movement's resilience. Their presence discouraged aggression, emboldened sympathizers, and provided a psychological shield stronger than any fortress wall. Even in regions where the Nizaris held no territory, their reputation traveled ahead of them, shaping how governors treated minority communities and influencing decisions made at court. Within Alamut's halls, the Fidai lived like any other member, sharing meals, attending lessons, and participating in rituals. They did not separate themselves from the community or demand special treatment. Their role became apparent only when assignments arose. Often, a Fidai departed quietly, with little ceremony, carrying instructions known only to a small group. Whether they returned depended on the nature of their mission. Those who survived shared lessons learned, those who did not left behind examples of discipline that strengthened the resolve of those who remained. By the end of these foundational years, the Fidai had become an integral part of the Nizari identity. Their existence demonstrated that survival in a world dominated by large empires did not depend solely on military strength. It depended on adaptability, unity, and strategic precision. Alamut's walls protected those within, but the actions of these disciplined individuals protected everyone beyond them. Their rise marked the beginning of a new era, one defined not only by fortresses perched on mountain peaks, but by the steady, calculated influence of individuals whose loyalty reshaped political realities across Persia and Syria. The world would soon learn that armies were not the only instruments capable of altering history. Snow lingered along the high ridges when Hulagu Khan's vanguard first entered the valleys leading toward the Nizari fortresses. The riders did not hurry. Their movements displayed the same deliberate certainty that had unraveled kingdoms across Asia. Scouts rode ahead in disciplined groups, marking paths and calculating distances between potential encampments. Behind them followed detachments of engineers, infantry, and supply caravans. The sight of this procession carried a clarity no message could match. The Mongols had not come to intimidate. They had come to dismantle. Inside the mountain strongholds, messengers relayed news of the Mongol advance with increasing frequency. Reports from distant districts described fortresses burned, villages emptied, and defensive positions erased in days. Those who reached Alamut carried tales of commanders offering surrender, only to witness devastation when local conditions delayed compliance. Each arrival brought another reminder that Hulagu's strategy allowed no space for negotiation that lacked immediate submission. Despite these warnings, the Nizari leadership attempted to maintain stability. Councils met in Alamut's halls to discuss provisioning, evacuation routes, and communication networks. Some leaders argued that the movement should concentrate its defenses around the strongest fortresses. Others insisted that every outpost, no matter how small, had symbolic value. These discussions revealed the difficulty of balancing immediate survival with long-term cohesion. No decision carried certainty, and every option held consequences extending far beyond individual strongholds. Hulagu's campaign began systematically. Rather than attacking Alamut directly, he targeted the outer fortresses first. These smaller positions served as barriers that controlled access to the central network. Girdku, Lamasar, and other strongholds faced probing attacks designed to force their defenders into exposing weaknesses. Artillery units tested ranges, engineers assessed walls. Every step served a larger plan that unfolded with relentless precision. Some fortresses surrendered early, hoping to spare their people. Others resisted when retreat was no longer possible. Siege engines hurled stones across ravines, shaking mountain walls that had withstood Seljuk assaults for decades. When gates fell, Mongol soldiers entered with clear instructions. Looting was controlled, captives were questioned, and in each case, survivors were transferred to camps where administrators decided their fate based on perceived loyalty. Hulagu did not treat these fortresses as regional nuisances. He approached them as obstacles requiring complete removal to prevent future threats. Inside Alamut, the atmosphere shifted from preparation to inevitability. Daily routines continued, water channels maintained, supplies distributed, lessons taught. But conversations carried an undercurrent of finality. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer. Elders who had witnessed earlier Seljuk campaigns recognized that this enemy behaved differently. Traditional methods of delaying or redirecting conflict no longer applied. The Nizari Imam, Rukn al-Din Kurshah, attempted diplomacy. Envoys approached Mongol encampments with formal submissions, offering tribute and pledging cooperation. They carried letters affirming the movement's desire to avoid conflict. Hulagu received these gestures but insisted on total submission, command of fortresses, surrender of leaders, and dismantling of walls. Kershaw hesitated to accept terms that would leave his people defenseless. The exchange continued without resolution, and each day of delay allowed Mongol forces to strengthen their foothold around the perimeter of Nizari territory. As these negotiations dragged on, Mongol assaults intensified elsewhere. In Kuistan, defenders fought until breaches opened in their walls. In Rudbar, resistance crumbled after prolonged bombardment. Each collapse sent survivors fleeing toward Alamut, and each group carried stories of destruction. Panic remained contained, but grief spread quietly through the strongholds. Many had lost relatives who had no chance to flee. Others mourned the fall of fortresses that had stood for generations. Within Alamut's stone corridors, meetings grew more urgent. Scholars debated how to protect surviving manuscripts. Commanders discussed rationing to preserve supplies in case of prolonged siege. Some proposed evacuating key families through mountain passes. Yet every option carried risks. Abandoning the fortress meant surrendering one of the movement's most important symbols. Remaining risked loss of life on a scale not yet seen in Nizari history. Hulagu continued his methodical approach. His engineers began constructing platforms on slopes surrounding Alamut, positions high enough to launch sustained bombardment despite the steep terrain. The work took time, but the Mongols were patient. Their campaigns rarely depended on sudden strikes. They relied on pressure, weight, and persistence. Each completed platform allowed artillery crews to test trajectories. Stones arced through the air and struck the outer walls with thunderous force. Cracks appeared in defensive structures previously thought unbreakable. Inside the fortress, shock rippled through the community. Alamut had survived countless sieges, but the Mongol assault introduced new forms of pressure. The defenders adapted, reinforcing weak sections and constructing internal barriers to slow any breach. Yet they understood the imbalance they faced. The Mongols could sustain their assault indefinitely. The fortress could not. During this period, some Nizari leaders urged decisive action, perhaps a breakout or a coordinated strike. But Kershaw recognized the uncertainty of such attempts. A single failed operation could provoke immediate devastation. He continued seeking negotiation, offering concessions in exchange for amnesty. These new messages traveled through snow-covered passes, under conditions that strained even experienced couriers. Their breaths froze in the air as they attempted to deliver the last appeals for mercy. Hulagu's terms remained unchanged. As winter deepened, Mongol forces tightened their control around the valleys. Camps expanded, supply routes stabilized. Additional detachments arrived with more siege equipment. Even defenders within Alamut, who clung to faint hopes, realized that a prolonged siege had become unavoidable. The fortress had once been the center of the movement's security. Now it stood as a target around which an empire organized its strength. The final stages of the siege began when Mongol artillery reached full operational capacity. Massive stones struck walls with rhythmic intensity. Wooden structures caught fire. Dust filled the air. Defenders sheltered behind internal barricades, waiting for the moments between bombardments to reinforce damaged sections. Amid the chaos, leaders instructed families to remain in lower chambers, far from exposed walkways. Kershaw attempted one last negotiation. He offered to surrender several fortresses if Alamut were spared. Envoys returned with Hulagu's reply. Total surrender was the only acceptable outcome. There would be no exceptions for the fortress that had symbolized resistance for decades. Faced with a reality that left no viable alternative, the Ismaili Imam agreed. The gates of Alamut opened. Mongol forces entered the stronghold that had resisted empires for generations. Their arrival marked not a moment of triumph, but the beginning of a dismantling that would reverberate through centuries of Nizari memory. Yet even in surrender, the defenders held their composure. They guided their families to safety, delivered stored provisions to the conquerors as ordered, and stood witness as the fortress passed out of their control. What remained uncertain, what haunted every observer, was how Hulagu would treat a community that had resisted him for months, and what would become of the knowledge, relics, and leaders whose presence had defined Alamut. The storm had reached its peak, and the fortress at the heart of Nizari identity now awaited its fate under Mongol hands. Once the gates of Alamut opened and Mongol commanders stepped into the stone passages that had sheltered generations of Nizari believers, an uneasy silence settled over the stronghold. The defenders who had held their positions for so long stood aside as the occupying soldiers spread through courtyards and halls, documenting the structure, measuring storerooms, and estimating the size of the population. The Mongols approached this work not with the chaos of raiders, but with the precision of administrators. Their conquest did not end when the gates fell. It shifted into a new phase of classification, assessment, and eventual dismantling. Kershaw's surrender spared the defenders from immediate slaughter, but no one inside the fortress mistook the outcome for mercy. Hulagu's orders left little room for interpretation. The Nizari state would not continue under new leadership or altered terms. It would cease to exist as a political entity. Alamut had served as its heart, its symbol, and its central command. As long as the fortress remained intact, the idea of resistance could survive. The Mongols understood this clearly. They approached their task with a commitment shaped by years of empire building. Eliminate any foundation from which rebellion might emerge. Inside the fortress, Mongol officers began identifying records, manuscripts, and stored correspondence. Scholars later recounted the vast collections found within Alamut's libraries, works on philosophy, theology, science, and history. Some manuscripts reflected centuries of scholarship preserved through careful copying. Others contained doctrinal writings specific to the Nizari tradition. The soldiers tasked with surveying these rooms reported their findings to Hulagu, who then authorized a process that left the community stunned. Many texts were removed and examined. Others were ordered destroyed. The flames that consumed these manuscripts illuminated the night sky above the mountains, marking the loss of knowledge accumulated over generations. While this destruction unfolded, the Mongols reorganized the fortress. Families were instructed to gather in designated chambers. Tools and weapons were confiscated. In administrative spaces once used for planning defensive strategies, Mongol scribes recorded lists of residents and classified them based on age, skill, and perceived usefulness. Their work did not carry the urgency of battle. It followed the routine of imperial procedure. Even in this final stage, the Mongols treated the conquest as part of a broader campaign rather than an isolated victory. The dismantling of Alamut's defenses progressed steadily. Engineers directed labor crews to tear down sections of the outer walls. Watchtowers were stripped of their wooden platforms. Defensive terraces that had once harbored archers were reshaped or filled, ensuring that the fortress could never again serve as a military stronghold. These actions struck the defenders harder than the siege itself. Each stone removed symbolized the end of a structure that had provided safety and identity. The fortress did not fall through force alone. It was unmade, piece by piece. Beyond Alamut, news of the surrender reached other Nizari strongholds. Some commanders complied with Kershaw's orders and opened their gates. Others hesitated, uncertain whether submission would spare their communities or invite destruction. Mongol detachments answered these questions swiftly. Yielding fortresses saw their leaders removed and their structures dismantled. Those that resisted faced heavier consequences. In certain regions, defenders attempted last stands that ended in devastation. These scattered acts of resistance, though courageous, could not alter the larger momentum of the campaign. As the Mongols advanced through Nizari territories, the movement's network unraveled. The communication routes that had connected Persia and Syria weakened. Local leaders who once coordinated operations under Alamut's guidance now sought ways to protect their communities independently. Some dispersed into remote regions beyond Mongol reach. Others blended into surrounding populations, preserving their beliefs quietly. The unity that had defined the Nizari state did not vanish, but it shifted from an organized political structure to a fragmented collection of resilient communities. Inside Alamut, the Mongols continued their methodical work. After securing the population and dismantling defenses, they turned their attention to the fortress's symbolic elements. Rooms associated with leadership were emptied. Insignia and banners were removed. Objects tied to ritual or governance were confiscated or destroyed. Each act served a clear purpose: to ensure that Alamut would never again function as a seat of authority. Kershaw and his closest relatives were taken into custody. Their departure marked the final separation between the movement and its central leadership. The Mongols intended to relocate them under strict supervision, ensuring that no figure could claim legitimacy in the wake of Alamut's fall. In the months that followed, Kershaw's fate became emblematic of the movement's collapse. His journey eastward, escorted by Mongol officials, reflected both the end of his political authority and the uncertainty facing the community he had led. In the surrounding valleys, families who had once relied on the fortress's protection now confronted a world without its shelter. Some sought refuge with relatives in distant provinces. Others remained in the region, adapting to the new order imposed by Mongol administrators. These officials maintained an interest in stabilizing the territory. They replaced local leaders, reorganized taxation, and attempted to integrate the region into the broader administrative system. Their objective was practical: prevent future rebellion by establishing clear lines of authority. Among the surviving Nizari communities, the memory of Alamut endured. Even as they relocated or concealed their identities, followers carried with them stories of the fortress's rise, its discipline, and its fall. These memories preserved a sense of continuity that political collapse could not extinguish. Although the Mongols dismantled the physical structure, they could not erase the teachings or the relationships that had sustained the movement. Across Persia, the aftermath of the siege produced a landscape transformed by both fear and resilience. Villages once aligned with Nizari fortresses adapted to new rulers. Markets reopened under Mongol supervision. Roads that had been unsafe during years of conflict became part of a larger imperial network. Yet beneath this new order, remnants of Nizari communities survived in quiet enclaves. They maintained their beliefs discreetly, passing traditions to their children and reinforcing a cultural identity that might outlive the destruction of their political center. The Mongol conquest continued eastward and westward, absorbing cities and kingdoms into an empire that stretched across continents. Yet for the Nizaris, the loss of Alamut remained the defining event of this era. It ended the political structure that had given them security and reshaped their presence across the Islamic world. Their survival would now depend on adaptability rather than fortifications, on memory rather than walls. When the Mongols finally withdrew from the ruins of Alamut, they left behind a landscape marked by immediate devastation and long-term transformation. The fortress no longer commanded the valley. Its walls no longer held symbols of authority. Yet somewhere among the scattered survivors, a quiet certainty persisted. The movement had endured far worse than political collapse, and its traditions would continue in forms that no conqueror could fully erase. The fall of Alamut closed a chapter, but it did not conclude the story. Other regions, other communities, and other leaders would carry the Nizari legacy forward, ensuring that the ideas born in the mountains would remain long after the stones of the fortress had crumbled. When word of Alamut's fall reached the Syrian mountains, winter winds had already swept across the Orontes Valley, carrying with them rumors that seemed almost unbelievable. For decades, Masyaf and its sister fortresses had looked toward Persia as both anchor and mirror. The Persian strongholds shaped doctrine, strategy, and organizational coherence. They provided legitimacy to local leaders, connected scattered communities, and offered a distant yet steady assurance that the movement remained united. Now, travelers from the east brought accounts of breached walls, burned libraries, and an imam removed from his citadel under Mongol escort. These reports spread through Syrian villages with the quiet force of an approaching storm. Inside Masyaf, Rashid al-Din Sinan had already passed away years earlier. His death had marked the end of an era, but his legacy lingered in every stone of the fortresses he strengthened. Under his leadership, the Syrian Nizaris had navigated a landscape shaped by Crusader ambitions, Seljuk rivalries, and Ayyubid consolidation. He had built a network that could adapt to shifting alliances, operate discreetly in contested territories, and maintain autonomy in a region where empires clashed. But Sinan's successors inherited a political environment very different from the one he had mastered. The Mongol advance into Persia changed every calculation. Despite these distant upheavals, Syrian life remained outwardly stable in the immediate aftermath. Fortresses stood intact, fields continued their seasonal rhythms, and inhabitants carried out daily duties under leaders who still invoked Sinan's memory. Yet beneath this surface, normalcy, lay a growing awareness that the foundation supporting their autonomy had fractured. Persia had provided more than doctrinal authority. It had served as a counterweight to regional powers. Without it, the Syrian branch faced the world alone. The Mongols did not immediately turn their full attention to Syria, but their presence reshaped the balance of power. As they advanced into Mesopotamia and the Levant, local rulers reconsidered their alliances. Some emirs prized survival over loyalty and approached Mongol envoys with gestures of submission. Crusader states weighed the possibility of Mongol support against the risk of provoking them. Each decision created ripples that reached even the mountain strongholds held by the Nizaris. At first, the Syrian Nizaris resisted the impulse to act. They watched closely as other regional powers negotiated or resisted Mongol pressure. Mamluk generals in Egypt, newly risen and eager to assert their strength, prepared defenses along key routes. Ayyubid princes shifted their loyalties, seeking protection or opportunity in the changing landscape. Crusader lords debated whether to join the Mongols in campaigns against Muslim rivals. None of these movements unfolded without consequences for the mountain communities. As Mongol raiding parties approached the outskirts of Syria, the Nizaris attempted to understand the intentions behind these incursions. Envoys traveled through dangerous territory to gather information. Their reports described swift attacks on villages, demands for tribute, and test incursions into strategic regions. None of these missions targeted Nizari fortresses directly, but their pattern resembled the early stages of the Persian campaign. A methodical approach, probing for weakness, evaluating responses, and shaping regional alliances. Sinan's successors debated whether to make contact with Mongol commanders. Some argued that early diplomacy could preserve autonomy. Others warned that any engagement risked attracting attention. They recalled the fate of Persian envoys, whose gestures of submission failed to prevent the destruction of their strongholds. In the absence of clear guidance from Alamut, the Syrian leaders faced decisions with irreversible consequences. For a time, inaction seemed the safest choice. Mongol campaigns directed toward Aleppo and other major cities diverted attention from the mountains. During these tumultuous years, Masyaf maintained watchful distance. Scouts monitored movements in the plains. Messengers traveled through forests at night. The strongholds continued their routines of training and doctrine, though with a growing sense that uncertainty defined the horizon. What ultimately transformed the Syrian Nizaris' situation was not the Mongols alone, but the emergence of a new dominant power in the region, the Mamluk Sultanate. Born from slave soldier ranks, the Mamluks carried a military confidence that rivaled the Mongols. They defeated a Mongol army at Ain Jalut, halting the westward advance that had seemed unstoppable. This victory shifted the balance of power, emboldening Egyptian rulers to assert control across the Levant. Their attention soon turned to smaller autonomous regions, including the Nizari fortresses. To the Mamluks, the Nizaris represented both a political inconvenience and a potential threat. Their strongholds perched above key routes linking northern Syria to coastal plains. Their alliances with local emirs complicated efforts to bring the region under unified administration. Their reputation for covert operations concerned commanders seeking stability. Mamluk leaders, committed to establishing clear lines of authority across the Levant, viewed independent mountain strongholds as unacceptable remnants of a fragmented past. The first encounters between the Mamluks and the Syrian Nizaris did not immediately lead to conflict. Diplomacy offered temporary stability, though rarely without tension. The Nizaris agreed to pay tribute in exchange for continued autonomy. Mamluk officials accepted these arrangements as long as larger priorities, consolidating territories and countering external threats, demanded attention. But this equilibrium remained fragile. As Mamluk authority grew stronger and more centralized, patience for semi-independent enclaves diminished. Within Masyaf, leaders recognized the shift even before formal threats emerged. Mamluk governors increasingly tightened control over towns near Nizari territories. Taxation systems expanded, garrisons strengthened. Local rulers who once relied on Nizari support or neutrality now answered directly to Cairo. The space for independent negotiation narrowed. Still, the Nizaris did not abandon hope of maintaining their foothold. Their ability to adapt had allowed survival through multiple eras of regional upheaval. They continued reinforcing internal cohesion, updating defensive plans, and maintaining relations with neighboring villages. Their strategy relied on patience, waiting for political changes that might restore balance or create new opportunities. But patience alone could not counter a determined empire. Under Sultan Baybars, the Mamluks launched campaigns designed to end remaining pockets of resistance across Syria. Their attention turned eventually to the Nizari strongholds. The campaigns unfolded not as abrupt assaults, but as a series of operations intended to isolate, pressure, and eventually incorporate the mountain communities. In some cases, garrisons surrendered with negotiated terms. In others, Mamluk soldiers breached walls after prolonged sieges. Masyaf did not fall easily. Negotiations preceded confrontation. Local leaders attempted to preserve some degree of autonomy, yet the direction of events was clear. Mamluk authority demanded not only tribute, but control. Even symbolic independence became intolerable in a political order striving for unity. Over time, concessions made by the Nizaris mirrored those that preceded the fall of their Persian counterparts. Fortresses opened their gates. Leaders recognized new rulers. The mountain strongholds transitioned from symbols of resistance into relics absorbed into a growing empire. Across the Levant, the fading of the Syrian Nizari state unfolded with less violence than the destruction in Persia. The Mongols had dismantled fortresses stone by stone, erasing any possibility of revival. The Mamluks approached their task through integration, replacing local authority, establishing garrisons, and ensuring that independent rule could never re-emerge. While some fortresses suffered damage, the broader result was political absorption rather than annihilation. As these transformations occurred, the movement's spiritual identity remained intact. Communities adapted to new political authorities without abandoning their beliefs. Practices continued quietly. Families preserved traditions, and teachings passed from one generation to the next. Local leaders, no longer responsible for defending fortresses, became custodians of memory and continuity. With the loss of the Syrian strongholds, the era of the assassins came to a close. Their methods faded not because of external prohibition alone, but because the political conditions that had necessitated them changed. The mountain states had emerged in a world defined by fragmentation, where survival required unconventional tactics and precision. Under Mongol and Mamluk consolidation, such fragmentation disappeared. The tools that once protected a minority community no longer carried the same purpose. Yet the Nizari Ismailis survived, not as lords of mountain citadels, nor as a movement operating in secrecy, but as a dispersed community able to adapt to shifting political landscapes. Their continuation reflected a truth that neither Mongol destruction nor Mamluk absorption could erase. The Nizari tradition rested not solely on fortresses, operatives, or political autonomy, but on a resilient spiritual lineage. By the end of this era, the mountains that had once echoed with warnings of approaching armies returned to quiet. Masyaf and other strongholds became sites of memory rather than command. What remained were families who carried their identity inward, preserving a history shaped by endurance through centuries of upheaval. The fall of the Persian and Syrian Nizari states closed the chapter of the assassins, yet the story did not vanish. It passed into chronicles, legends, and whispered recollections, all shaped by the echoes of a world where mountain fortresses once stood as symbols of defiance and resilience. When the last Mamluk detachments withdrew from the Orontes foothills, and the dust of their horses faded into the afternoon heat, the mountains settled into a stillness unfamiliar to those who had lived under threat for so long. Villagers stepped cautiously into the open, listening for sounds of soldiers or scouts that never came. The fortresses that had once defined the skyline, Masyaf, Al-Kaf, Kadmus, stood intact but quiet, their garrisons replaced by small administrative teams loyal to Cairo. Years of tension, expectation, and calculation had ended not with the dramatic collapse that struck Persia, but with a quieter, more gradual transformation. The Syrian Nizaris had not been extinguished, but the political world that had sustained their autonomy had receded into history. In the wake of these events, the mountain strongholds began to shift in purpose. Where Fidai once trained on narrow terraces, Mamluk officers now stored supplies and recorded taxes. Chambers that had sheltered doctrinal discussions became mundane administrative rooms. Watchtowers that had monitored crusader patrols and rival emirs now overlooked quiet valleys where farmers worked without fear of sudden raids. Symbols of authority were replaced, walls were repainted, and banners bearing Cairene colors fluttered where Nizari standards had once flown. The communities inside these fortresses faced a difficult adjustment. They had known generations of leadership bound to Alamut and sustained by Sinan's legacy. Now they lived under governors whose priorities lay far away. Yet this transition unfolded with less violence than many had feared. The Mamluks focused on building a unified state capable of resisting future Mongol incursions, relied on administrative integration rather than punishment. They replaced leaders, enforced new rules, and dismantled political structures. But they did not attempt to erase the population itself. For the Nizaris who remained in Syria, this offered a fragile but genuine opportunity to continue their lives. Their religious practices, conducted privately and without political ambition, carried none of the strategic threat that had once provoked hostility. Families adapted by cultivating orchards, managing trade ties, and participating in local markets. Their identity persisted quietly, protected not by mountain walls, but by resilience developed over generations. As the fortresses changed hands, the legends surrounding them began to drift into the realm of memory. Travelers passing through the region recorded stories told by elders about the old days, narratives shaped by both pride and uncertainty. Some described Sinan as a figure of extraordinary insight. Others recalled periods of conflict with distant rulers. Many spoke of a community that had endured far longer than anyone expected. These accounts varied, but each preserved a fragment of what the Nizari state had represented: independence, discipline, and a belief in their rightful place within a larger spiritual lineage. Meanwhile, further east, the remnants of Persian Nizari communities adapted to a different reality. Survivors who escaped the destruction of Alamut and the other strongholds dispersed into the mountains of Kerman, the oases of Badakhshan, and the remote valleys of northern Afghanistan. There, in landscapes shaped by rugged isolation, small groups reconstituted themselves. Without fortresses, without an imam present, without the structured councils that had guided previous generations, these communities relied on familial lines and itinerant teachers to preserve their traditions. Some followers fled westward, seeking refuge among Syrian relatives, but most found that the safest course lay in staying quiet and remaining unnoticed. Mongol administrators, tasked with stabilizing newly conquered territories, focused on large cities and strategic regions. Remote villages attracted little attention. In such places, Nizari families maintained the essential components of their faith: rituals, teachings, and allegiance to an imam they could no longer reach. They nurtured memory as their primary form of resistance. Over the decades that followed, the disconnection between Persian and Syrian Nizaris gradually deepened. With Alamut gone and Masyaf absorbed into Mamluk administration, the networks that had once carried instructions, letters, and doctrinal guidance fell silent. New leaders emerged locally, shaped not by mountain councils, but by the needs of their communities. Their priorities centered on survival rather than political influence. In this environment, the image of the assassins began to dissolve, replaced by the quieter identity of a dispersed religious minority. Yet the world beyond these mountains and valleys did not forget the legends. Crusader chroniclers, unable to observe the movement directly, passed exaggerated accounts through European courts. Soldiers returning from the Levant spoke of men who could slip through guarded camps and strike princes in broad daylight. Merchants repeated stories heard from villagers, reshaping them into adventurous tales. Persian historians, writing after the Mongol conquest, described the Nizari state with a blend of fascination and criticism. Each retelling drifted further from reality, shaping the enduring myth of a secretive order that commanded absolute obedience and possessed extraordinary skills. These legends, despite their inaccuracies, preserved the memory of a period when the Nizaris wielded influence disproportionate to their numbers. They also obscured the reality that after the fall of their political centers, the movement continued as a community defined by endurance rather than tactics. The world remembered the Fidai, but it overlooked the teachers, farmers, merchants, and families who carried the tradition through centuries of uncertainty. In Syria, the Mamluk period introduced new forms of stability. Roads reopened, trade lines expanded, and fortified towns shifted from military posts to administrative hubs. Former Nizari strongholds became part of regional defense systems protecting against potential Mongol raids from the east. Over time, the population blended with neighboring communities. Families intermarried, shared harvests, and adapted to economic rhythms shaped by the larger political framework. Their identity remained internal, defined by memory rather than visible markers. Farther east, Persian Nizari communities gradually reconnected with emerging lines of leadership. Surviving descendants of the Imamate, concealed for safety during Mongol rule, resumed contact with dispersed followers. These renewed ties restored continuity to the tradition. Teachers traveled across remote regions, gathering scattered families, offering doctrinal guidance, and rebuilding a sense of unity. The political state was gone, but the spiritual community endured. Generations passed, and the Nizari Ismailis evolved into a diverse, geographically dispersed population, stretching from Iran to Central Asia, from India to Syria. Their communities adapted to the political climates of each region, living openly where permitted, quietly where necessary. By the early modern period, the identity of the assassin had faded into folklore, while the religious tradition persisted through new institutions, intellectual contributions, and community leadership. What had once been a state governed from mountain fortresses became a global network shaped by education, philanthropy, and cultural continuity. In the Levant, the stones of Masyaf and the other Syrian fortresses remained. Travelers visited them with curiosity, scholars studied their architecture, and villagers passed them during seasonal migrations. The original banners no longer flew above their gates, but the memory of their inhabitants lingered in local stories. Some spoke of daring missions and secret councils. Others remembered periods of peace protected by mountain walls. All recognized that these fortresses represented a chapter in regional history shaped by courage, conviction, and resilience. By the end of this period, the Nizari Ismaili story had reached a new equilibrium. Its political center had been dismantled, its military arm dissolved, and its regional autonomy absorbed into larger empires. Yet its spiritual heart survived. Families continued traditions taught by ancestors who had once lived in fortified halls. Scholars preserved texts rescued from destruction. Communities adapted, endured, and redefined themselves through changing centuries. The fall of Alamut and the absorption of the Syrian strongholds marked the end of the assassin states, but not the end of the people who built them. Their story moved from the battlements to the households, from fortresses to memories, from political influence to cultural endurance. And across the Islamic world, in regions far from the mountain peaks where the movement once flourished, the Nizari tradition continued, shaped not by the shadows of blades, but by the quiet persistence that had allowed it to survive every storm it encountered.